Well, we want to go to our next guest, who we kept waiting a little bit here, who we are very honored to be joined by always. That's Zoe Alexandra, journalist and co-editor of People's Dispatch, who's joining us to talk about a few things happening in Latin America. Zoe, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thanks for having me. Excited for this little trip across South America.
Well, excellent. Zoe, Rania, and Eugene's excellent adventure. Let's start with something positive, since I just did it that way. Ecuador, where we have seen some electoral setbacks in the left in the past couple years, just saw some big turnarounds here. There were recent elections, I believe, for both governors and mayoralities. Tell us, Zoe, what took place there.
Well, yes, there were elections that took place on February 5th and major gains for the Citizens' Revolution movement. As you said, there have been several electoral setbacks, but also a very, very fierce lawfare campaign against, of course, the Citizen Revolution's leader, Rafael Correa. He's essentially been banned from even returning to Ecuador, which has severely weakened the movement. Of course, he was president of the country for many years. In this context, after the candidate of Rafael Correa, Andrés Arauz, lost the elections in 2021 to Guillermo Lasso, who's just kind of the representative of everything of the neoliberal system. He's a banker, very deeply involved in putting forth a lot of these neoliberal policies. There has been a reconstruction of the left, and that's what we saw in these elections on February 5th. They gained many important mayor's offices, specifically of Pichincha and other major cities, Guayas as well. And in addition to these electoral victories, there's also just been a serious political setbacks for Guillermo Lasso. This week, there was a report published by a local media outlet which revealed serious corruption allegations that could be taking place with people very close to his government. So Lasso's really on the back foot. Conservatives, which thought they had been able to kind of beat back the Citizens' Revolution at the polls and kind of weaken them with lawfare campaigns, putting people in prison or charging them with corruption, is now seeing that not only is it going to be defeated in the polls like it just was in these local elections, but also there's a lot of information coming out that points to very, very high people in this government having actual links to corruption, which is, of course, what they accuse the leftists of having.
So, Zoe, I want to move to a different country now on our little journey, and that is the country of Peru, where there have been repressive protests. You were actually on the ground not that long ago reporting on those protests. Many people have been killed in the aftermath of the essentially the overthrow of Pedro Castillo. Can you update us on what's happening in Peru?
Definitely. Well, as you said, it's a very tumultuous situation. It's been a little over 2 months since Pedro Castillo was overthrown in a legislative coup in the country. And since then, there's been complete unrest on the streets of the capital, of major cities and provinces in the South specifically. As you said, the repression has been something that's, I think, really unprecedented. Over 60 people have been killed. Some reports say it could be over 70. There's people with extremely, extremely serious injuries. And a lot of the people who have been killed were actually killed with firearms from members of the army, from members of the national police. So we're not talking about impacts from tear gas canisters. We're talking about live bullets being shot from security forces at protesters. And as you've covered on the show, I'm pretty sure that the major demands of the people on the streets who have been on the streets for really 2 months at this point is for Dina Boluarte, who's the de facto president of this coup-installed regime, really, to say it that way, that she resign, that the right-wing Congress, which has a 90% disapproval rating, that this Congress be dissolved, that immediate elections be held in this year, in 2023, that Pedro Castillo be released. Many are calling for his restitution as president, saying that his removal was illegal. And one of the biggest demands is holding a constituent assembly. And the response of the government for 2 months has been to deny all of these demands, has been to kill people, has been to repress, has been to put people in prison. There's many cases that have been opened up against leftist leaders, progressive leaders, human rights activists. Journalists have been targeted, have been specifically targeted by police. Their equipment has been confiscated. I mean, it's a really serious situation. And of course, the response of the Organization of the American States and the US government has been essentially to turn a blind eye, to release, after maybe 15 people are killed in one day, they say, oh, that shouldn't happen. That's not great. They should really try to preserve the life of the people. But in terms of actually any measures against Dina Boluarte or any strong condemnation of her government, there's essentially been zilch. The leaders across the continent have been extremely important in terms of denouncing this violence and denouncing the actions of her government. And in return, a lot of them have actually been banned from entering the country, which is an interesting development.
Wow. Well, serious ongoing situation. I just want to mention, among many other superlatives I could add, Zoe is the co-editor of People's Dispatch, where all of this is being covered quite frequently on a very updated basis. Another issue that's obviously roiling Latin America and that roils the whole region really is the impact of U.S. sanctions. One of the most sanctioned countries is Nicaragua, allegedly for so-called human rights abuses, but of course we see countries like El Salvador, like Guatemala, with, I think you could say it's way worse, not the same thing, so it's obviously somewhat political. But some major developments here, 200 individuals were released from prison, so-called political prisoners from the United States, says the United States government. They came to the U.S., and then Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, had a phone call with the foreign minister of Nicaragua, Denis Moncada, there's almost no communication between the two governments, so this was a pretty big thing in terms of, I don't know, what it potentially could mean. Maybe just tell us a little bit more, Zoe, about what took place there and whether or not that perhaps portends some changes in how the U.S. is approaching the left-leaning governments in Latin America.
Well, it's definitely an interesting development. People who have been accused by the Nicaraguan government of participating in the failed coup attempt in 2018 for stoking what they classify as terrorist violence, for committing acts against the nation. Some are even accused of treason. For that reason, they had been in prison and such now been deported to the United States. And this is an interesting development, as you said, not only in terms of, the U.S. actually opening up communication with the country, which it's had extremely harsh words against, but also I think it's indicative of the different ways that these countries are grappling with these counter-revolutionary attacks on the government. How do you actually deal with this? How do you bring justice? This is one example. We've seen different versions in Bolivia, in Venezuela, because, what to do with these people that actually participate in such violent and such disruptive protests. In this case, they said, we're returning you to the people who are paying you, and that's the U.S. government, which was an interesting, very on-the-nose move. But yeah, I think you're exactly right that this does indicate that the U.S. is realizing that it has to have a different attitude towards the region. Before, Nicaragua was surrounded by Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was, a far-right big friend of the U.S., and to the south, he had, far-right government in Colombia. That has changed. Now you have Xiomara Castro to the north, who's really about integration, has been an extremely active member in forums like CELAC, and has really been advocating for an end to U.S. imperialism in the region. So I think they're realizing that they can no longer actually have this hostile and antagonistic attitude when the region itself is coming together and saying, we have differences, we have different political ideologies, we have different political systems, but at the end of the day, we have to work together for our common good. And I think the U.S. is realizing that they can no longer attempt to divide and conquer with regards to these more socialist-leaning governments and states. So that's why we're seeing kind of rapprochement measures, even with Cuba, despite the fact not lifting all of the sanctions and the blockade, and of course not removing it from the U.S. sponsors of terrorism list. That being said, they're still taking some minimal efforts towards warming relations in some way. With Venezuela, again, there's definitely some progress in the relationship there. So I think this can also be kind of classified as part of this general warming towards these countries.
Well, Zoe, just before we let you go, let folks know where they can find People's Dispatch. And since it is Thursday, let them know where they can also find the Give the People What They Want show from People's Dispatch.
Well, you can find us on all social media platforms at People's Dispatch. And every Friday, we host a very fun news roundup show with our great friend, Vijay Prashad, and with myself and Prashant, who's the other co-editor of People's Dispatch. Another kind of world tour situation of the weekly news, 30 minutes, tune in. You can find that on our YouTube page. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for having you on. I hope thanks for coming on, Jesus Christ. I hope everybody checks out Give the People What They Want. It's almost like an Olympic sport, the way you guys cover so many different issues there every week on Friday mornings. But thanks again for giving us some of your time here.
Thanks.